Good evening. Hi, I'm Claire Berry, Director of Conservation here at the Kimball, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Tony Sigel back to the Kimball this evening. Tony will be presenting this evening's lecture, Sculpture Conservation in Action, Bernini's Modello for the Fountain of the Moor. Tony is the Senior Conservator of Objects and Sculpture at the Strauss Center for Conservation, Harvard Art Museums, where he's responsible for the treatment and study of three-dimensional art from ancient to contemporary. After receiving a BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, he was trained as a conservator at the Art Institute of Chicago Museum. In 1993, he received a Certificate of Advanced Training in Objects Conservation at Harvard University Art Museums. He has worked for 5 summers as the Harvard Cornell Archaeological Excavations at Sardis, Turkey, most recently as supervising conservator. He has published, lectured, and taught widely on conservation practice and technical art history topics at Harvard, the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, and elsewhere. His early training as a sculptor led his technical study and publication of Baroque terracotta models in collections worldwide. In 2004, he was awarded the Rome Prize, spending a year as fellow at the American Academy in Rome, studying works by Bernini and others. Most recently, he co-curated a comprehensive study of Bernini's terracotta sculpture for the exhibition Bernini, Sculpting in Clay, which opened in 2012 at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and in 2013 at the Kimball Art Museum. Together with C.D. Dickerson and Ian Wardropper, Tony also served as co-author of the exhibition catalog. In September 2016, he was appointed Robert Lehman Visiting Professor at Villa Itati, Florence, studying the techniques of Renaissance sculptural models. Joining Tony this weekend on his visit to the Kimball is his wife, the poet Jennifer Clairvaux. Jennifer will be the Kimball's featured artist at tomorrow's Artist's Eye program at the Kimball in the Kahn Building at 11 a.m. We will be meeting in the South Galleries. Jennifer is a poet and will actually be the first poet to present in our Artist's Eye series. And she will be revealing something about the Bernini terracotta that Tony's discussing this evening that Tony will not be telling us. So that's just a cliffhanger for you. Jennifer's actually written a poem about Bernini's Modello of the Moor, which she will be reading to us tomorrow. And she will lead a fascinating tour of terracotta sculptures in the Kimball collection. So I hope many of you will be able to join us tomorrow at 11. One last reminder to please silence your phones. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Tony to the stage. Thank you.
Everybody hear me okay? Thank you, Claire, for that really lovely intro. And thanks to you and Eric and all of the folks at the Kimball for bringing me back to give a talk tonight. It's really a treat. This is a fabulous institution that we're all very lucky to have. So without further ado, here's our guy. Seen in these 2 self-portraits in his youth and old age. Bernini was born in 1598 and died in 1680. His father, Pietro, was an excellent sculptor. They lived in Naples, and from a very early age, young John Lorenzo showed a remarkable talent working with his father, and very shortly they decamped to Rome to pursue opportunities for him. Very quickly, John Lorenzo found the patronage of Cardinal Scipione Borghese and commenced in a very short period of years on his series of mythological and biblical marbles that really made his name. He worked for many, many popes over the span of his career. I want to say 6, but it's probably 8. And not just a sculptor, but also an architect. St. Peter's Square and the colonnade were his. He really remade the face of Baroque Rome and made it the fabulous place that it is today. Bernini's habit was to make small sketch models or bozzetti of works that he was designing, sometimes many small models, such as this angel for the Ponte San Angelo that we see on the right, the angel holding the superscription, and also the angel holding the crown of thorns. Both of these terracotta models are in the collection of the Kimball. They're very fortunate to have examples of both of the small sketch models and larger presentation models also made to present to the client. And in the case of the Bernini Moor, that would have been Pope Innocent X. When Innocent X was elected in 1644, he enlarged his family palace at the south end of Piazza Navona, which sort of would have been this end here. And he commissioned Bernini to create the Fountain of the Four Rivers, which, we see right here. It was an astonishing success, and still remains one of the greatest fountains, certainly in Rome and in Italy and perhaps the world. And given that success, the Pope decided that at each end of the piazza, he would have Bernini renovate existing fountains, a fountain of Neptune on the north, which actually was not executed during Bernini's time. But here at the south end, a fountain which would become the fountain of the Moor. So Bernini's first effort was this shell atop a pair of entwined dolphins. The Pope didn't think very much of it, unfortunately, and it was shipped off to the Villa Doria of Pamphili, where you see it in this picture here. So he sent Bernini back to the drawing board, and Bernini came up with this scheme of 2 entwined tritons wrestling with dolphins. Set of dolphins. The drawing is on the left, and on the right is the terracotta model, which now lives in the Bode Museum in Berlin. You can see the head of one of the dolphins here. There's obviously been some damage and losses. Unfortunately, the Pope really didn't think very much of that either, and sent Bernini back to the drawing board, where he came up with this rather marvelous triton wrestling with a dolphin standing on a shell, floating it on the fountain. Bernini didn't actually carve the marble himself. One of his studio sculptors did, Giovanni Antonio Mari. And while it's terrific, it's been unfortunately weathering out of doors for a great deal of time. And also it just really didn't have the crispness and the detail and the activity that Bernini's terracotta Modello shows. This is the Modello that the Kimball Art Museum acquired in 2002. I think it's 2002. I'll be corrected on that. And this is after the conservation treatment. I'll show you the before images shortly, but I want to talk a little bit about conservation first and just give you an idea of the steps that the treatment took. So there's a great deal of planning that goes into deciding what to do with a very important piece of sculpture. A photographic documentation campaign is carried out to record its condition before the treatment. And someone like me works with the curators, owners, museum director, other conservators, conservation scientists, in order to really figure out what the best way to proceed is. There's sampling of old restoration materials, such as a variety of old adhesives, old restoration paints, because we need to figure out how to unlock them and take them away, take them off the surface where they don't belong. The cleaning is the next step, kind of an overall cleaning carried out in stages. And along with that is the removal of older, unstable, incorrect restorations. And then comes a stage of disassembly. This had been reassembled, glued together, restored several times in the past, and many of the glued joins were no longer strong. The glues dry out, they become weak, and there was evidence of a fair amount of repeated restorations of certain elements, which I'll be showing you shortly. When everything's taken apart and cleaned, then it's time for reassembly. And when that is carried out, it's time to decide what should be restored and what should be left as it is. So, conservators work with certain ethical goals in mind. One is reversibility, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that later, but that's probably the main thing that conservators think about, is that what we do to a work of art should be able to be relatively easily undone without affecting the work of art permanently. And that's because we may do things that, according to our lights, are correct, but future generations may judge them not so much, and will want to restore those areas. But for this particular piece, I wanted to conduct the cleaning in steps gradually, so that one area wouldn't be dramatically cleaner than another one could be cleaned. I wanted to protect it during the treatment. They say that during the restoration of a building, it's prime time for fires or other accidents to occur. I think we've all heard of that, the Glasgow Art School, very sadly. So the sculpture is vulnerable when it's being taken apart and having these fairly radical things done to it, and we try to protect it. The previous restorers may have used techniques that we wouldn't use today, dowels and clips and staples and drilling holes and things, but the fact that they have gives us certain opportunities to reuse those, and in some cases that was done. Previous restorers throughout history have caused damage to works of art, some of them including the dowel holes and clamps having holes drilled for them that I mentioned. Sometimes paintings are overcleaned, or were overcleaned, I should say. So we make every effort to, or at least conceal the damage that has occurred by restorers. other kinds of damage that may be historically interesting or important, we may choose not to restore. As you'll see, I chose to use techniques when I was restoring certain elements that I borrowed from Bernini. I made copies of his tools, and we'll be taking a little bit of a look at that. And also in conservation, we always try to use the most stable, most reversible materials, things that will not yellow or shrink or fade or discolor, that can be reversed, as I was saying before, with the same solvents that were used to apply them. So that's a real tenet of conservation. And again, as I was saying, to make things as reversible as possible. You'll see during the course of this treatment that I had to go to some pretty interesting lengths to carry it out. And I'd like to make it a little easier for the next guy in 100 years to deal with. So let's just jump right in and take a look at it as it came to me in the conservation studio at Harvard. You can see it's not terribly clean. For one thing, there's sort of a grayish tonality overall. The surfaces are sort of multicolored. You can see that some rather horizontal surfaces, and strangely, these rivulet-like patterns are etched into the surface. There's holes from where perhaps the original arm broke off, was doweled back in place, and is now lost again. There's a rather patchy area here in the back, a fair amount of plaster fill and restoration paint covering the surface around the middle. And further down, where the rocky base sits below the shell, there's a very large area of restoration fill that doesn't really match the adjacent rocks on either side in color, texture, shape. This is a break across the midriff of the sculpture. So I'm beginning to understand that this sculpture led a very hard life, broken in several places over periods of time, restored several times. And I also had analysis done on these brownish areas that seem to have some kind of a coating on them. And the conservation scientist came back with the information that it was a material called soluble nylon, which was a fad coating in the conservation profession from about the mid-1950s till about the mid-1980s. And unfortunately, it was not terribly soluble, and its use was discontinued in the profession for resins and coatings that were more reversible. So my theory was that the sculpture had been restored, coated with this material, and placed outside for some period of time, maybe several decades, maybe in a fountain, maybe in somebody's palazzo garden. And that coating had partially weathered off. Just go back a little bit so that you can really see the streaky nature, and it seems to have worn off on the horizontal areas where sun might hit it and rain might hit it and so on, and the rain might have been responsible for these rivulet patterns. There were other kinds of damage that I mentioned, breaks in the ankle and with the loss of the original terracotta, breaks in the knee, most of the leg, ankle and knee, and on the other leg too. You can see there's a fair amount of old fill material and paint and adhesive. It's and have been fixed a few times. So to get a better understanding of what was really going on now on the inside of the sculpture, we made a series of x-rays. Most conservation labs, including the one here at the Kimball, have x-ray facilities for looking at both paintings and sculpture. And I really discovered a great deal about the sculpture by doing so. First and most obvious, Bernini had taken great pains to hollow out the head and the chest. His small sketch models are all made solid, and that's because they were considered disposable by him. He probably made thousands of these over his working lifetime, and we have about 50 or so left that are generally thought to be autograph and genuine. But for the larger presentation model, and I should say it's about this tall, just to give you some idea of the scale. He took more pains, and he hollowed the chest and the head because if he had left them solid during the drying period and then in the firing period in the kiln, big solid masses of clay like that tend to crack and then possibly even explode in the kiln, which would have been a real shame in this case, and he certainly felt so because he did take the time to hollow them out. And you'll also notice these elements. I should say that X-rays work by dense materials like metal and like very thick clay blocks the X-ray, and so they appear white. Areas that appear dark in the X-rays where the clay is very thin or there's no metal present. So, this looked to me a little bit like a hardware store inside. There's a big iron spike that was serving as a dowel to join the fracture that we saw earlier across the midriff. And then there's a series of these staple-like clips, and we'll go on to see these a little later. But they were a means to join big, heavy chunks of fired terracotta together, maybe even in an age where there weren't modern adhesives like we have today. Maybe at the time when this was restored, the two principal adhesives were either shellac or hide glue made from rendered animal parts. So at this time, they used these mechanical metal staples to join things together. So one generally begins a project like this by cleaning, and you like to clean the sculpture when it's still all in one piece because you can judge each section as you go along and clean it all evenly and consistently. And the first cleaning, I just used simple deionized water and a soft brush, scrubbing the surface and then transferring the dirt onto paper toweling and just going back and forth. First doing the whole sculpture with simple water and then moving on to water with a conservation grade detergent in it. But again, not cleaning too far here and not enough there, but trying to keep it all balanced. And in some areas, I could use simple cotton swabs like conservators like to use to pick up grime, and you can see that can be quite effective. Let's take a closer look at the back here. This area had a lot of overpaint, and you can see it's lumpy and discolored and kind of doesn't have the beauty of the adjacent surfaces. So it seemed like an old restoration to me, and I started exploring it using a scalpel and just gradually peeling the paint back and using other solvents and things to slowly remove this old restoration. And I was very surprised to find a rather large hole in the back. This is right below the right shoulder blade. So I started with a scalpel, and when I got to the point where I realized it was a hole, I realized that I could slowly enlarge it by using a little saw to cut pieces out and take them away. And when I got to a certain point, I could see inside. I could see that the interior had been filled with plaster of Paris, and not a terribly adhesive material. Whoever restored the sculpture last had decided to solidify that fracture or series of fractures through the midriff by pouring plaster into the sculpture and filling it up, basically. Well, it worked, and that's the kind thing that can be said of any restoration attempt from the past, that if it succeeded in holding the sculpture together or the leg still attached, it was successful, and it brought it all these hundreds of years forward so that we could still enjoy it. So, having gotten really all of the restoration material off, I'm going to jump forward a little further in the treatment to where it's been completely cleaned and put back together, because you can see that the edge of the hole has these linear striations, and that made me realize the purpose for the hole. Obviously, this whole section had broken away and it is now lost. There was a surface there. But during the final stages of modeling, Bernini had cut a hole in the back of the sculpture and reached in with scoop-like tools to hollow out the chest. That's how the chest had been hollowed out originally. When he was done, he took a modeling tool and roughened up all of the edges, cut out a small plug of clay and fitted it in, and then smoothed it all over and continued the modeling. So what we're seeing is an access hole, really, to which the lid has sadly been lost, and that would need to be recreated further along in the restoration process. Similarly, this section of rocks here that encompasses about 1/5 of the circumference of the bottom of the sculpture had been broken and lost at some point. And the restorers had just kind of made this undifferentiated meatloaf-like hunk of restoration material. That would have to come off, and a suitable restoration would have to be made. And here I am taking it off. I used scalpel and carving chisels and other tools to slowly work my way through. You can see I've exposed a great deal of plaster of Paris. Some of it is tinted brown, other is left white. There's another section of maybe a more recent restoration that is someone made out of clay and probably fired in an oven. Metal dowels, now rusty, are holding it all together. But it all had to come off. Other kinds of cleaning are happening along here. This is the tip of the seashell, and you can see the bottom of his left foot perched on the shell. This is after cleaning. And notice there's a nice space here now, and there wasn't before. I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a minute or two. There was so much restoration, and it was so soiled. This is a passage below the shell in the rocky outcrop. And I started cleaning it and realized that when someone had been restoring a passage higher up in the sculpture, they'd spilled a bunch of plaster on it, and it just dried. So this middle image shows where I've wetted the plaster, which softens it a great deal. And I'm taking a scalpel and I'm just carefully picking the loose plaster away. And I'm revealing Bernini's original tool marks that he created for this passage. And in fact, this is after the cleaning and removal. It's an after treatment image, as we say. And it's exposed this whole interesting passage. This was supposed to be a rocky outcrop where rivulets of water would flow down from the shell to the rocks. I'll just say another word about the whole rocky outcrop, and that is the Moor fountain, the marble Moor fountain in Piazza Navona, contains no rocky outcrop. The seashell, which we see the bottom of here, sits right on the water. So in this model, Bernini chose to perch the shell on a rocky outcrop, but for the final fountain, that was not a part of the final design. Here I'm using a tool that has come into more and more use in conservation studios. It's a laser that's used for cleaning surfaces of three-dimensional objects, often in marble sculpture where it does a tremendous job, and also with terracotta. It's called an ND YAG laser, and it's not too dissimilar from lasers that are used to remove tattoos, actually. Conservation's not a huge field, so we have to borrow tools from wherever we can find them. And here's the laser in action. We generally wet the surface down because that helps the cleaning process. Because it involves steam, the laser, in effect, is hitting the grayish soil area, and when the laser sees that dark material, it vaporizes it. But it doesn't, it bounces harmlessly off the underlying terracotta, and that's all a question of setting the power levels and so on. So it's a repeated pulsing flash, and every time the pulse hits a dirt layer, it vaporizes it. So it's actually a wonderful and marvelous way to spend the day, cleaning dirt off of the sculpture. And here's the surface afterwards. You can see the bottom. And I chose this photograph because this is part of the dolphin's skin, and it has these little scales on it, and each loop is maybe 5 millimeters wide, and the sculptor's tool swoops through the clay and leaves a little pile of clay at the end of each stroke. And if I was scrubbing at this with a swab or even a toothbrush or a little soft brush, I would run the risk of breaking off these tiny little crumbs of clay that enliven the surface and really give you that sense of immediacy and freshness that Bernini intended by leaving them. So the wonderful thing about the laser is it's a non-contact cleaning method, and there's no abrasion to the terracotta surface. And here's sort of mid-cleaning, or actually a little further. You can see the threshold of cleaning right about there. So in a sense, it just lifts a veil of soiling off that would be very difficult to get off any other way, because as I've said, I've already cleaned the entire sculpture with water and a very mild detergent and brushes. So, time to take it apart. Most of the glue joints, as I've said, were extremely unstable, and it was really time to create a more stable reconstruction. This is the Moor's right foot. You can see that it's broken at the ankle, and broken here and repaired. A lot of soiling and discolored coatings and overpaint and so on. And as I mentioned, the foot was firmly cemented to the shell. Well, I began to clean with a swab, and a lot of fill material started coming off. And by the end of it, I realized that the previous restorer had actually taken a saw and cut the foot off of the shell. I had no idea why that might have happened. The surface of the shell also, you see it doesn't fit very well. The surface had been filed down with a rasp. And this is the cleaning further along, and you can see a pile of plaster had been inserted under the heel, which I cut off, again with a small saw. Very charming little foot. And I love this extremely antique wooden dowel that previous restorer had used to join the two together. And you can see the remnants of dried adhesive flaking away in various places. It just wasn't held together very, very well anymore. This is fast forward to a little further in the process when I've cleaned and reconstructed the foot and put it back on the leg. This was never attached because these marks are the marks from a wire cutting through the clay. Only right here, you see these are saw marks. Those are the marks that we saw left from the saw. And that's what made me realize that the foot was originally pitched up so that just the toes were gripping the shell, so that the figure was springing off of the shell, or intended to be. That was how Bernini had made it. And here we see that. This is again after the restoration. So by filling this whole area with clay and painting it to look like, with plaster and painting it to look like clay, the previous restorer had really sort of deadened the dynamism of the character of the Moor. So it was great to be able to return it. I encountered other areas where the original clay had been lost. This is in the middle of the shell. There's a great deal of discolored overpaint there, which I removed to find a fairly poorly shaped plaster restoration. And again, not wanting to remove and redo something that was only needing to be reshaped, I built upon the original plaster restoration and simply recontoured it and then in-painted it. And that's another conservation term that I'll explain. Rather than overpaint broadly onto original surfaces, conservators these days will in-paint. That is, they'll paint in only the restored area. However, I also needed to recreate the tool texture. So using the lids of plastic containers and other things, I made some flexible squeegees or spatulas with tool mark shapes cut into them. This is me testing my tinted fill material on the lid of a jar to get my technique down before applying it to the sculpture itself. So now it became time to tackle the principal break through the torso. And this is where the scaffolding comes in. I had to reach inside that hole that Bernini made to hollow the piece and begin to carve away all of that plaster to free the original upper section from the lower section. So I constructed out of foam this scaffolding that was tied in place so that, should I go a little further than I meant to here, I wouldn't have the top toppling onto the floor or some other horrible disaster like that. I'm a firm believer in belts and suspenders when doing this kind of work. So now here's a little video of that process of carefully hollowing the inside out. And you can see that this side piece has already become slightly loose, and I've taped it up. So again, it won't fall off while I'm clearing out the inside. And there, it's coming off. You can see Bernini's tool marks on the inside. And now I have more room to continue carving that plaster away. Scary fun. And here's the upper section resting comfortably after that work. So that was the disassembly of the upper portion, but the lower portion too here are some of those metal staples now, and the brakes at the foot. I've already removed that lower leg, but there's a number of brakes in this section too that were, visibly unstable. So I'm using a camera stand up here to act as a scaffold, protecting that while I remove the metal staples and prepare to finish the disassembly. Strangely, some of the staples were actually on the outside of the sculpture. The previous restorers had drilled the holes and sunk the staples in using plaster to hold it in place. So I was able to soften and pick that plaster away, and then clean the holes, fill losses, and this is that passage after treatment. Some of the staples were a little difficult to get out, so I had to essentially cut them in half by drilling successively larger holes with larger drill bits until the staple broke in half, and I could take each half out. And sometimes that would require picking away at the tinted plaster that was used to hold it in place. There were several of those like that had to be drilled out. And here's the kind of sequence of treatment. This is the as-found condition. That's fill and overpaint on that surface, and here's where a little of the fill has broken away because of the movement of those joins. In the middle picture, I have removed all the fill and the overpaint and exposed the staple, and then I then took it out using the methods that I've just shown. And this is an after-treatment photo where all of these cut channels and cracks have been filled. The sections have been adhered back together using a conservation grade adhesive. A gentleman approached me before the talk and was wanting to know about reversibility. So we make our adhesives, and we use an acrylic resin that we buy in bead form that is water white. It doesn't yellow. In several hundred years, it's resoluble in the same solvent that we mix it in. And we can mix it to the consistency that we need, thick or thin, depending upon the task at hand. So this joint is all reconstructed here in this image. And now I'm taking that lower section apart with a colleague, Angela Chang, conservator in my lab. Yeah. No. Okay. Oh, it's coming in two pieces. So she's manning the camera stand to keep tension on these ropes.
And maybe go around to the other side.
grab this piece that seems to want to come out, and maybe you can tell me if anything else is going on. You see that piece? Can everybody hear that okay? Okay. This should just come straight up.
Yep.
Okay. Great.
You're okay.
Yeah, well, can you take that piece off safely?
A lot of it's going to crumble down with it.
Does it want to stay where it is?
No.
Okay, then take it off.
Okay, I won't.
Wow. Yep, this is why this needed to be rebuilt. Holy Toledo. And what I was referring to was this collection of terracotta sherds that tumbled out as Angela was lifting that piece off and I was raising the... So those things had been locked in place, but as the sculpture traveled around and everything jiggled around, little pieces broke off but were held in place, and then when I removed that large section, they were all free to fall off. And that's a scary thought when you consider that this sculpture traveled from Italy to London to New York to the Kimball and then back to Cambridge before I began working on it. So, again, resting comfortably. And you can see in this broken section what a terracotta looks like on the inside, a solid terracotta. It's not a continuous, thoroughly integrated hunk of clay, but it's really a collection of shrinkage cracks and losses and gaps and voids. And so you can imagine I consolidated this very carefully before gluing it back together. And here I am trying to find out where all those little pieces went. This is the section that Angela had grabbed a hold of right there. And I was able to put most of them back in place, kind of like this. Here's our adhesive that I've prepared and put in the tube. And I have a little piece to reattach. Get it perfectly aligned. The glue sets pretty quickly. Inevitably, there's a little squeeze out that needs to be cleaned off. So I take a brush and dip it in the same solvent that the glue is made with, and I'm cleaning it off the surface here. So, day by day, this took about a year altogether. And now it was time to put the upper torso back on. You can see that one of those old staple holes has been partially filled here, and ready to put the legs back on up to the torso with a lot of adhesive and tying it in place with twill tape to act as clamps. And as I was talking about reuse before, this is an example of a place where I would never drill holes and cut channels to hold these metal staples in place as a part of a modern contemporary restoration. But because someone did, and I knew that this sculpture would continue to travel, certainly back to the Kimball Museum, and then we didn't know this at the time, but to the large Met Kimball Bernini Terracotta Models exhibition of 2011 and 12. So I did make new brass staples, and I adhered them in place with a thickened bulked adhesive, the same adhesive. The entire sculpture was put together using this one adhesive, which is resoluble in acetone or even acetone vapor. So everything that I put together can be undone and cleaned off using simple acetone. this is that passage after filling and in-painting those losses in the staple channel. Here I'm using the same bulked adhesive to reattach the foot to the shell. And, there were quite a lot of losses to be made whole here. And I needed to recreate Bernini's tool marks on those surfaces. Finally, time to reattach the upper section using straps and tapes and clamps and whatever was needed to ensure that all the sections were replaced back in alignment. And this is just an example of after that reassembly, needing to fill and in-paint losses from those breaks. And then it was time for the hard stuff. How to deal with this hole in the back and also the losses in the lower rocky area. Obviously, couldn't be exhibited this way. So I first turned to the marble sculpture itself, but there just wasn't very much detail there, as you can see. The care and attention that Bernini paid to the musculature and modeling of the terracotta was really quite a bit more extensive and detailed than Giovanni Antonio Mari carried out on his marble sculpture. So I had to turn elsewhere for information and inspiration. These are all photographs of either Bernini's marble sculptures, other of his marble sculptures, or his terracotta models. I used treatises on anatomy. I got a friend to pose for me with his shirt off in that pose. I won't show you that picture. But it was all tremendously useful, and it informed the creation of a replacement for that area. And I decided to use Bernini's own techniques. In other words, I modeled it in clay. So this is actually a non-drying hobbyist modeling clay. It's called plasticine, usually in this country, or sculpey, something that kids model with. And it's close to the terracotta color, which helps judge shapes. And I also needed to recreate the brushy textures that Bernini left in the surface of the terracotta as a finishing technique. So I used these pieces of screen to impart that brushy texture. So this is all during the process of creating the form, and there it is on the left, sort of where I was satisfied, and my colleagues and the people that I worked with. Again, this is not a singular effort. I'm working with curators, and I'm consulting with my fellow sculpture conservators and visiting scholars, conservation scientists, and whoever else I can drag in to help me know when something is right or when something is done. So being made out of fairly soft non-drying modeling clay, I needed to figure out how to get it out in one piece without bending and distorting it. And I used this freezing spray to make it, to freeze it. And it made it hard enough so that I could withdraw it safely without damaging the fragile edges. This is a little wire loop that I had buried previously in the clay that I could use to pull it out, again, so that I wouldn't have to handle the edges. By a process that I'll spend a little more time on when I show you the recreation of the rocks in just a moment, I took that plasticine model, made a mold out of flexible mold-making material, and I cast it in plaster, cleaned it up, and here you see it glued in place. So I've essentially recreated a missing sherd from the sculpture, and by being able to glue it in place, it reinforces structurally this whole area, which has breaks here and another break there, and so on. So this is after completing the in-painting of that area. And I did that first because I thought that would be easier than this, the large section missing on the bottom. Here it is all prepared and cleaned with all of the old restoration removed. And the rocks are covered with tool marks from many of Bernini's specific modeling tools, and I realized that in order to recreate this as Bernini did, I would need to recreate his tool set. So again, with silicone rubber molding putty, I made molds of all of the tool textures that I found on those rocks adjacent to these areas. And then, actually, this is the handle of a paintbrush. I carved and filed the shapes in my own tools so that I could recreate these passages. Here's another one, both shown with Bernini's original clay and a bit of this non-hardening modeling clay. And yet another one. And notice this one with the widely spaced teeth looks a lot like a marble carving chisel and leaves those kinds of marks. And I suspect that unlike people who model terracotta today, people in Bernini's studio, and maybe Bernini himself, simply used his iron modeling chisels and scrapers. These would have been in iron too, interchangeably on marble and in clay. So here I'm beginning to build up with handfuls of clay. The tin foil is to keep the somewhat sticky plasticine from sticking too hard so that I could get it off at the end of the process. And this is a little sheet copper tray, again, so that when I wanted to take it away from the sculpture and cast it in plaster, I wouldn't have to handle it with my fingers and possibly damage it. So it took a couple weeks to arrive at a satisfactory shape and texture and size of continuation of the rocks. You can see the original area here, and I don't know if you can kind of see it there, but there's a lot of material lost. Went from there to kind of a shape like this. I call this the dog head period. Eventually it evolved away from that a little bit, and you can see I've begun to try to imitate the textures in the plasticine that I found on the adjacent original terracotta. And finally got it to this point where I was pretty happy with it, and the colleagues and curators and folks that I showed it to seemed pretty happy with it. So it was time to take it off and prepare it for translation into plaster. So I've used my little handles, and I've slid it off the bottom of the sculpture. It's reasonably intact. And I made a little box for it and poured the silicone rubber molding material in the box. When it's cured, I pull it out, and here I've just taken that plasticine out. It became fairly damaged in that process, but it left me with a beautiful, flexible rubber mold that I could pour my plaster into. And here's that step. And here is the final completed plaster restoration section. And I fitted it onto the bottom of the sculpture just as a test here. And I'm not going to put the raw plaster on there. I'm going to take the plaster and I'm going to consolidate it, or it's really just soaking it in a very dilute solution of that same acrylic resin that I used to make the much thicker adhesive. And that stabilizes it, makes it very permanent, and provides an excellent base for the painting, the in-painting to be carried out. So at this stage, I've taken an airbrush and I've given it an overall terracotta coloring. But as you can see, it looks quite dead. So at this point, I've glued it in place, and I'm starting to tone it. I'm starting to give it all of the patina and character and handling, soiling. And notice how various raised surfaces of the sculpture are somewhat darker. That's from centuries of handling, and it's part of the patina, if you will, that I left during the cleaning process very consciously so that it wouldn't have a raw, over-cleaned look. And I'm using watercolors, and we have liquid water-based acrylic paints that are very light, fast, and stable that we use in conservation. And this is the final result. Here's a detail of the original on the left and the recreation on the right. And this join between the two, we decided to leave not filled or in-painted, but as a signal that this is where the original ends and the restoration begins. And there are other firing cracks that it resembles, so it blends in very nicely. So here's the before and after image. And I think it came out pretty well. Thank you. It has absolutely been a career highlight. I have to thank the Kimball again for entrusting it to me, and a bunch of other people too. And thank you all for coming and listening. And very happy to take questions.